This is Common Ground with Sonja Wolf. In today's episode, we're going to talk about Mediterranean crossings and Italy's migration crisis narrative. My guest today is Eleanor Paynter. She is an assistant professor of Italian, migration, and global media studies at the University of Oregon. And she is also the author of Emergency in Transit, Witnessing Migration in the Colonial Present. Welcome to the podcast, Eleanor.
Thanks so much for having me. Good to be here.
So I invited you because your recent book gives us an opportunity to talk about migration and migration policy, but in the European context. Many people across the world undertake precarious journeys to flee different kinds of crises, whether it's violence and conflict or economic precarity, the impact of climate change, or perhaps gender violence. And at the same time, we also see patterns in migration policy, particularly when we look at countries of the so-called global north that often implement deterrence and border externalization to prevent irregular migrants from the global south to reach their intended destinations. So before we look at how Italy has addressed irregular migration and what is happening to migrants in Italy, I wanted to begin by looking a little bit in a broader sense at the situation of migrants in Europe and also at the context of Italy. A few years ago, there was talk of Europe's refugee crisis. What was behind this idea of a refugee crisis?
Yeah, I'm sure many of your listeners will remember, especially 2015 as the year when this crisis really dominated global headlines and became and the experiences and processes and also images of people trying to reach safety in Europe became known as a refugee crisis around the world. And a lot of that was brought to light in part through the arrival of Syrians along the Eastern Mediterranean route. So going from Syria, often through Turkey and landing in Greece and then making their way up. That this was the year when over 1 million Syrians reached Germany to seek asylum. And so there was a lot of talk about the refugee crisis as a matter of what to do in response to the perceived suddenness of all of these arrivals of people from, in this case, from war-torn countries. Of course, migration wasn't new. And in fact, we see across the Mediterranean, and I focus in particular on that central Mediterranean area. So the area of crossing between Libya, Tunisia, and Malta and Italy, and in the Mediterranean in general, migration has always been part of life. And since the early 2000s, these crossings have been increasingly precarious. So while 2015 was marked as really a watershed moment for this so-called crisis narrative of displacement towards Europe, in Italy, it had already been talked about as a crisis or an emergency, certainly since 2014 in explicit policy terms, but narratives of migration as a crisis date back in Italy several decades. And so zooming back out to the European context, I think some of the questions that have arisen in this broader context of people from many different places making their way, as you said, leaving their home countries for a variety of reasons, variety of forms of precarity, and making their way to Europe to seek safety, to try and establish a better life, has brought a lot of questions to the fore in terms of how migration is regulated in Europe. So a question of the so-called what's called the Dublin regulation and the subsequent policies that have been implemented about who should be responsible for processing asylum applications. What happens once somebody has entered the European Union, and what rights do they have to continue moving on? And all of those questions have been really hotly debated, especially since 2015.
The area of the European Union is often referred to as Fortress Europe, and Italy is one of the border states of the European Union. How does this division of labor perhaps work between the EU and the border states when it comes to controlling or reducing irregular migration?
Yeah, Italy, of course, plays a key role. Italy, Greece, and Spain all do as forming that southern border. And part of what comes to mind immediately when you ask this question is the burden narratives that countries like Italy have forwarded as a way of expressing their discontent with the role that they've come to play. So, because the Dublin regulation stipulates, and I'm referring to the Dublin regulation, there are subsequent pacts that have tried to shift how some of this works. I can say a little bit about that, but the way that it's been governed since in the decade that we're talking about specifically today has been through this regulation that stipulates that a person has to apply for asylum in the country where they first set foot in the EU. And so in many cases, that means Greece or Italy, now increasingly also Spain. And that has meant that what Italian administrations have often called this burden of housing and processing really falls on them. It's also true that many of the people who are crossing the sea to reach Europe don't necessarily want to stay in Italy. And so they're hoping to perhaps they already speak French and they're hoping to go to France. Perhaps they have family in Germany. They're hoping to reach a place where they know they could more easily find work. There are a lot of reasons why Italy might not be their final destination, but because of this regulation that Italy is required to house them and handle their application for asylum or humanitarian protection. And with increases in numbers and a lot of issues in how reception has operated as a system in Italy, there's a lot of backlog. So it means that people who enter the country, instead of it just taking a couple of months, they might end up stuck there for a couple of years while they're trying to wait and see if they will in fact get protection. More recent policies have tried to do what the EU is calling a kind of burden sharing. So trying to offset some of this burden by sending migrants further on. I'm saying migrants as a kind of umbrella term, just to not refer to specific legal status. But in this case, we're talking about mostly people who are seeking asylum. So sending them to Germany, for example, or that if Germany didn't want to take them, they could send funds to Italy to cover the cost of some of that. The implementation of this continues to be fraught. And so you're still seeing a lot of this, I'll use burden for lack of a better word, but a lot of the work of accommodating people does remain in those initial countries of entry.
Italy is part of the European Union, but at the same time, it also has a special relationship with Africa as a former colonial power. And I was hoping you could sketch out a little bit for us what it's like in contemporary Italy. And Italy as a country of migrants, but also how the social and political situation is affecting migrants.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, this is one of the reasons why I think Italy is an especially interesting case for thinking about contemporary questions of refugees and migrant rights, because it is a place where we see how these really longer entangled histories come to shape how borders are policed and how people move. And I can connect this back to what you mentioned earlier about Italy being along the border of what gets called Fortress Europe. So until the 1970s, 80s, Italy was a country of emigration with an E. So predominantly people were leaving, going elsewhere. It's always been a country of movement. So people moving from south to north, people, again, the Mediterranean country, people have passed through Italy for centuries. And it was what we would call a sending country for a long time since its unification in 1871. So that started to shift in the 70s and 80s. And around the time of the Schengen Agreement, which allows for freedom of movement within Europe, Italy becomes a predominantly destination country with more people entering than leaving. And so a lot of factors are sort of coinciding in this moment. The Schengen Agreement makes Italy the southern border of the EU in a very clear way. So freedom of movement within the EU and more stronger controls of entry and exit out at the external borders. And Italy is trying to figure out whether and how to police migration into the country on its own terms. And so around 1990, you start to see the first comprehensive immigration legislation in Italy, Italy grappling with its role as Fortress Europe. And then you enter the 1990s and we see historical circumstances like political regime change. I'm talking about the post-Cold War moment, but also the collapse of government in Albania and people fleeing across the Adriatic to Italy. And so right around the time when people start coming to Italy in higher and higher numbers, we all already start to see the country framing these arrivals in emergency terms. So with those early Albanian arrivals, part of those arrivals were also from Somalia, which is a former Italian colony. And so in 1991, with the start of Somalia's civil war, you see a lot of people trying to come, in that case also by plane, as they could still arrive in that way, to seek refuge in the former colonizing power. And so there's a longer history of people from former colonies seeking protection in former colonizing powers in Europe. And Italy's specific role there is especially interesting because it's often disregarded as a colonial power. This is true also in its narratives about itself. So there's a common way that people talk about this in Italy still today is they say Italiani brava gente. So the Italians were good people. They were better colonizers, friendlier colonizers than the French or the British. The Italians built roads, for example. They built schools. But of course, we know that that's not the full story, and that Italy carried out genocidal campaigns in the Horn of Africa, and it colonized Libya, which is one of the countries that nearly everyone coming to Italy now passes through on their way. So I'm trying to bring all these threads together, but I guess one of the things that I would say in answer to your question about the colonial past is that there are some very specific ways in which we see these contemporary migrations connected to longer colonial histories. So places where people have struggled since colonial rule because of how colonial boundaries were drawn, and are fleeing those places now and coming to seek refuge in former colonizing powers in Europe, and then the specific place that Italy has in that. In broader terms, I would say Fortress Europe is a really important example of the coloniality of border control, that the ways in which the European Union, Frontex, the border agency, and Italy specifically are setting up agreements to police their borders, to exclude certain people, in particular people from former colonies, from former European colonies in the Global South, to exclude them from entering, keeping them from accessing legal ways and safe ways to enter, is a prime example of the continuation of colonial power dynamics.
You mentioned that Italians themselves have long migrated either from the south to the north, or they have looked for opportunities abroad. Has this kind of mobility created a need for foreign migrants in Italy?
People migrated to other places for a range of reasons. And one of the consistent reasons that people have left Italy is because of economic precarity. That was as true in the beginning of the 20th century as it is for young people today who struggle to find jobs and are also leaving the country in what often gets called brain drain, right? Young educated people who are going elsewhere to find work. It's true, for example, in the agricultural sector that as Italians have worked less and less in that sector in harvesting and day labor, for example, migrants have grown in number in filling in that work. It's maybe a little more complicated than that because there are also, the factors of exploitation and shifts. And this is also a time of seeing changes in how the global economy works and what that means for people on the ground. But yeah, one of the one of the ways that people also think about this in the Italian context is by looking at the relationship between northern Italy and southern Italy. And there's a longer history there also of tensions between the north and the south, and the idea that the south was underdeveloped, that it functioned in some ways as a colony of northern Italy in the early days of unification. And that was one of the main sources of migration, both to northern Italy and also out of Italy. So southerners going to northern Europe, going to the Americas, to Australia. And now today, it's also the place where people enter the country, and it remains an important agricultural area. So that is one example, perhaps.
You mentioned that many of the migrants come from Italy's former colonies in Africa. So it seems that Italy is receiving many young Black men. And before we look more closely at how migration has been framed as an emergency or a crisis in Italy, just in general terms, how are these migrants perceived in Italy on the part of the general population, but also how have politicians responded to the situation, especially as we have seen a shift toward the right in recent years?
Yeah. First, I would say that while there are a significant number of people from Italy's former colonies, there are also people from many, many different African countries. And so from former European colonies more broadly. And what that means and why it's important in answering this question is that people have different degrees of connection to Italy specifically and different access. So while Eritreans may actually have some familiarity with the Italian language, Nigerians don't, in general. And that affects how they can, maybe their connections to communities in Italy, but also how they can access processes of integration and that kind of thing. As is true in other contexts, what you see as one of the legacies of, or the longue durée of colonialism is the ways that race has been constructed, and ideas of Blackness in Italy can be traced directly back to colonial propaganda and discourses of otherness that became solidified through those colonial campaigns, again, especially in the Horn of Africa and in Libya. And so there's a lot of anti-Black racism, and that is, I think, a really important aspect of this to recognize and understanding the kinds of xenophobia and the kinds of anti-immigrant rhetoric that circulate right now. So what you see, and you can even, if you think about images of the so-called crisis, what you often picture, because this is what we see in the news, are these very precarious boats, so unseaworthy fishing boats that have been repurposed to carry people, or rubber dinghies that are really packed full of young Black men. And that has come to be associated with the idea of migration as a threat, or the idea that, on the other, that migrants are criminals, that they're coming here as economic migrants who are just gaming the system. So I think a lot of those racialized discourses are also themselves a direct connection to the coloniality of contemporary migration governance, and also the way that people are perceived in general. That's not to say that that racism is the only way that this operates. I mean, there's also a lot of really good solidarity work and anti-racist pro-migrant rights work happening in Italy, but I'm talking about sort of dominant discourses and the ways that political leaders in particular have talked about how to justify closing borders, for example.
You have carried out extensive research in Italy, including ethnographic research, and this has allowed you to spend considerable time with migrants, also with volunteers who support migrants. And there's one idea that is important in your book, and that's the idea of witnessing. Why did you realize that this was important, and what is behind this idea?
Yeah, I really appreciate this question. This is one of the ways that I try and shift thinking about these very pervasive crisis and emergency framings of migration. So a few ways that I think about this in broad terms, and I can talk about the place that it played in the ethnographic work too. I think of emergency as a product of witnessing. I talk about it in the book as a site of contested witnessing, where all of these different kinds of testimony come together to produce what we then recognize as a border crisis or a refugee crisis or an emergency. And this is true in a couple of ways. First, witnessing or testimony is the critical genre for asylum seekers. So their future depends in large part on the testimony that they give to officials, bearing witness to why they had to leave their home country, why they need protection, in this case in Italy. So witnessing plays a key role in displacement and rights recognition. But also, you can think about all the different kinds of witnessing texts that circulate outside of that very narrow legal context. So journalistic witnessing, eyewitness reports, the reports that NGOs produce, all of these are the testimony that go into this, the plethora of films about the migration crisis, and then all kinds of writing. And, all of that together, again, produces what we then come to know as a crisis or emergency. So those are some of the big picture ways that I think witnessing is really important. In my own work, I think about testimony as method. I talk about that in the book. So thinking about witnessing as a practice that I use, for example, in conducting interviews with people. So listening to people testify to their own experiences and I do oral history. So thinking about also centering the narrator and the story that they choose to tell and how they choose to tell it. And I'm especially interested in that how question. So what do they choose to prioritize and how do people put this story into words? And in ethnographic work, I'm also a witness. So my own presence, right, of course, also shaped the kinds of stories that emerged in those interviews and also what I came to pay attention to. And so I'm interested in how all of these different kinds of witnessing come together, both to reveal the operations of emergency. So how does this actually function and affect people's lives? But also, especially in listening to migrants bearing witness in these very different ways, how does the way they understand their own experiences allow us to see migration outside of emergency terms? So, the people that I spoke with in Italian reception centers and camps did not see themselves as the source of a crisis or as the primary subject of a crisis. They saw their movements in very different ways, and are doing a lot of critical work to, I would say, that helps us rethink those framings.
Let's take a closer look at what you call the emergency framework. There's this idea that you present that politicians and the mainstream media, for example, have created these narratives about migration as an emergency or a crisis. What exactly do these labels entail, and how at times are they mobilized? What functions do they have?
Yeah, and one of the things that I became really interested in, well, two things in doing the research for this book. One was that, especially in 2015, 2016, I was still seeing a lot of things on the news that were framing migration as an emergency and focusing on the very external borders. So arrivals at the Italian island of Lampedusa, death at sea. So talking about what was happening at or just outside of Europe, at Europe's borders. But when I traveled to places in the center of the country and in southern regions, I saw situations that made clear that what was getting called an emergency was actually taking shape throughout the country and changing how people encountered migration and migrants on a daily basis and what they thought was really what they could understand about those realities. That was one thing, just about thinking about how it operates. And then I was also paying attention to how all of these discourses circulate. So while I was speaking with people about their struggles to get protection, the long wait that they had in reception, the uncertainty about what would happen in the future, what they had experienced in Libya en route to Italy. I was watching all of these larger narratives play out that, again, were framing people as a kind of anonymous mass of threatening figures moving towards Europe. So I think we see one of the things that emergency framings do is focus our attention on the present. So there's an Italian historian who talks about that. Like Lucci talks about this as an obsession with the present, that it focuses us on what's happening right now without regard for the longer histories at play, even histories of migration, certainly not the colonial history that may play into things, but it also limits people from looking towards the future in more productive, generative ways. And so what we see in a place like Italy is a constant focus on crisis, on arrivals, and on resolving a current moment and a current set of problems without long-term planning. So without really thinking creatively or with a lot of, with a lot of care towards what to do to think about long-term community questions, long-term well-being. These emergency frameworks are things that we see in Italy, but these are common throughout the global north. So this is a very common framing for how people think about migration, in particular from the global south to the global north.
People might think that what is called an emergency might be happening just in the Mediterranean or perhaps at the physical border. But geographically, to what extent does this construction of the emergency also reach into Italy?
I think it's really important not to think about, just like I would argue against thinking about migration as a linear journey from point A to point B, right? These are longer and more complex, winding journeys, but they also don't end with arrival to Italy. So they don't end when someone gets off a boat on Lampedusa or gets rescued at sea, but they continue. Part of that is because people arrive and then enter into a system where they have this prolonged limbo while they wait to learn whether they'll get asylum. But it's also because what we've been talking about in terms of racial politics there, that they confront a whole set of obstacles in terms of not just legal status, but their ability to find housing, get a job. So this is a much longer limbo. And if you think about people who reach Italy and hope to move elsewhere, then they might have to start these processes over, or think about how to settle in very different terms as they continue moving. So I think for an individual person who's moving, that journey is a longer one. In terms of emergency, I think in Italy we've seen these responses. So what I talk about in the book is emergency responses to migration affect local communities in really direct ways. For a long time, certainly in overt ways since 2014. So between 2013 and 2014, arrivals quadrupled. And one of the responses, and I'll mention this because it's a great illustration of these emergency responses. So Italy decided to open a new type of reception center. And it did so by opening these centers in all 20 regions of the country. So when somebody arrives to Italy, they disembark in different places now, but let's say they disembark in Lampedusa, they would go through processing and identification at a large hotspot center there. And then they would get sent to one of a series of centers, but in all likelihood to one of these emergency structures anywhere throughout the country. And so that's affected the presence of migrants. I mean, that's reshaped some local dynamics in terms of who's there, who's visible, and what locals see or don't see about migration. It's meant that, it's meant different things about local jobs also. Local people are working in these centers. And I think we've seen in different ways this play out in terms of also, how national politics then come to play out at a very local level.
In your book, you write quite extensively about how testimonies, writings, and films can be used for migrants to express themselves, also by solidarity groups to promote migrant rights. And I thought it was interesting how you wrote also about the migrant boat. Our listeners and viewers who perhaps had the opportunity to go to the Venice Biennale in 2019 will remember that one of these migrant boats was on display. So I wanted to ask you how the migrant boat generally as an object, but also as a symbol, has been used in Italy, and what you thought specifically of the use of this particular boat in Venice as an artwork.
Yeah, this is a boat that I've followed since it was resurrected from the seafloor, actually almost exactly a decade ago. So, and it's a good example of, I guess, how these how the political discourses and the ways that people think about the stakes of these discourses have shifted over time. And you can think about this. I mentioned already the very common image of Black African men crowded onto these vessels. And so that has come to symbolize crisis for many people, either because migrants are seen as threatening criminals, or because they're seen as just kind of helpless victims who are coming over, in either case, anonymous, in a kind of anonymized mass. And so the boat has come to contain both of those discourses, I think, of criminality or vulnerability. And so it's used to kind of reproduce these binaries for people, and prevent a more broader recognition of the actual complexity and the heterogeneity of these migrations and of the groups of people who are in fact reaching Italy. The boat that you're talking about, which when it was installed at the Biennale was called Barca Nostra, our boat, which is also kind of a reference to Mare Nostrum, our sea, which is this old Roman name for the Mediterranean, but it was also the name of the mission that Italy led to rescue migrants in 2014. So pre-2015, leading up to this wreck. In April 18, 2015, this boat wrecked near Lampedusa. It was carrying, estimates have varied, but up to 1,100 people, many of whom lost their lives, many of whom were from former Italian colonies, so from Ethiopia and Eritrea in particular. And this was a time, 2015, when European leaders were talking about crisis responses in humanitarian terms. So sometimes it's hard to remember this because the discourses have shifted so much. So now the focus, especially in Italy, is really on closed borders, on externalization, as you mentioned at the top of this episode. In 2015, there was still a push to show that Europe, to show what people call European values, that Europe recognizes human rights. And so the prime minister at the time, Matteo Renzi, led an effort to bring the sunken ship up from the seafloor, something that very rarely happens. This is a longer story about the ship being brought up as part of the criminal investigation to figure out if they could track down the traffickers or smugglers who had steered the ship. But then it was also this humanitarian symbol. We have to stop these deaths at sea. They're too common. These journeys are too risky. And then it was installed by a Swiss Icelandic artist named Christoph Buchel at the Biennale. So this global art exhibition, where it was put on display in a part of Venice called the Arsenale, which is a medieval fortress setting, and it was put there without any contextual notes. So if you had the catalog, you had a note about it. But if you were just one of the thousands of visitors who shows up to Venice and gets a ticket and wanders in and out of the exhibitions, you might not even know that this was part of that exhibition. And there was certainly nothing at the site of the boat. Was rising up on the edge of this canal, this waterway. Nothing to tell you that it was a boat that had carried hundreds of people to their graves. when I went to see it in person, I noticed there was a bar right in front of it, and so people were also just sitting at a bar, having a beer, eating a snack, and not really knowing what they were looking at. I asked a few people if they had any idea, and they didn't. So this has become a very controversial discussion. There are some people who say that's exactly the point, and so um, he was trying to show this sort of the limits of seeing and how people refuse to recognize what actually happened. To my mind, this is this was an actual vessel that carried people to their death, and to have it there without context risks perpetuating some of those erasures that are part of the problem, right? That allow people to be anonymized, erased, racialized. Um, the boat has since returned to Sicily, so it's in the town of Augusta there. And I've stayed in touch with the committee that's trying to set it up as part of a memorial garden and do continued work to think about the question of memory and questions of rights that boats like that symbolize. Other thing I would say is that another really important part of this project is the connection. I mean, I've been talking a lot about the fact that these are Black Africans moving across the sea, not exclusively, right, but in large part in the central Mediterranean. And we're talking about colonial relations in contemporary movements. And so the ship is this symbol of what's happening now, but a lot of scholars, including people like Christina Sharp, have also talked about the clear connection between today's migrant ships and the slave ship, the historical slave ship. So I think that's an important provocation to think about what it means that people are that people crowded into ships today, might be also moving, as Sharp says, in the wake of those histories. And that's also one of the ways that I think about emergency. So emergency is this set of discourses, policies, practices, experiences, this apparatus that keeps people focused on the present and that shapes people's lives. It's also a way that Black scholars and writers have talked about Black life and the precarity and uncertainty of living in the wake of colonialism and of enslavement. And so that also factors into something like the boat, but also into the ways that I think we are obligated to think critically, to listen, to engage with the many kinds of testimonies that do circulate.
You mentioned that migrants may struggle to find housing in Italy. The authorities themselves have created official reception centers, which are different from private options, which I'd like to turn to in a moment. But the official reception centers, how do they function, and what is life in those centers like for migrants?
Yeah, and so here I would also say this system, systems are different in every country, but I think you could have an interesting discussion about the difference between reception and detention. There are a set of centers that I'm not talking about right now that are repatriation centers or these deportation centers that are also an important site for thinking about what can happen once a migrant disembarks in Italy. The reception centers are places where people are freer to come and go from, and these are the spaces where people are sent after they disembark and are processed, then they would get sent to a center in one of the 20 regions. And these are operated, so they're funded nationally, but operated by local teams. So in the case of the centers that I mentioned earlier, which are the emergency structures, they're called Centers for Extraordinary Reception. Those are formed when the government will say, we need a center opened in this region. They're trying to balance how people are spread out around the country. And a local group can put forward an application saying, we'll run the center. We have this team. We have these capacities. We have access to X space. And importantly, we're working with this cooperative, which is like some kind of cultural organization that will help us think about programming, integration processes, that kind of thing. So you can see how, so what happens often in the emergency structures is that they use repurposed buildings. So I spent a lot of time in buildings that had been they were hotels that had fallen out of use or closed after the 2008 crash, for example, and that were brought back to life in a different form through the arrival of migrants. You can see how, because of this setup, the dynamics at each center vary greatly. So by chance, someone might get sent to a center in a very tiny town in the region of Campania, for example, that has a team that's super dedicated, that has brought together a set of resources that's offering training for people to become like pizza makers, or support for going to school to get your high school certified, that kind of thing. Or you can end up in a space where people are trying to use that national funding, to its limit, with offering the minimum of resources available. So I saw examples of people doing really incredible work and thinking about their work as a kind of solidarity practice. And I've also seen and heard stories of really troubling corruption in these centers. So there's a big range, I think.
What has the relationship between migrants and communities been like? You mentioned that many migrants have a particular relationship with Italy. They feel perhaps closer to Italian culture. How have migrants, when they're housed in reception centers, tried to build a relationship with the communities, and how in turn have the communities perceived the migrants?
For a lot of communities, of course, migration isn't new. There are a lot of places in southern Italy that even have kind of monuments to the immigrant, so people who left. And there are places that have seen people coming from Eastern Europe or from North Africa for a long time. But in many of these places, especially in smaller towns, the presence of Black Africans was new. And so this is a moment for these communities of grappling, in some cases for the first time, with the racial politics of migration in very particular ways. And I think the people that I spoke with were struggling with this in different ways, as they shared in interviews. So again, there are always examples of places that have worked really hard to promote, sharing across communities and that kind of thing. But in general, I think people really struggle in part because of how the system works. So a lot of these centers are set up on the edges of towns. In fact, since some of the fieldwork that I've done, a lot of centers have been even closed in cities and moved to rural areas. So people are really separated. Migrants are really separated from local communities, and there's a kind of structural segregation that happens. And that means that their efforts to meet locals, practice their Italian, involve, having to find their way into the city center, having to kind of approach people. In many cases, they're not allowed to work. Their working rights are limited. So I think it can be very complicated for people to try and show that they have a genuine interest in connecting with locals without getting a response that's generated by suspicion, whether that's because of racism or because people are worried that migrants are, gaming the system and just there to try and work under the table, something like that. And because there's a lot of uncertainty about, and I think problematic narratives about the idea that these young Black men come and they just loiter and hang out and they're up to no good. The reality is they're housed in centers on the edge of towns. They're often not allowed to work, and they're in this extended limbo. So they're going to be there for even 2 years without being able to establish their own routine in a way that might make them more recognizable as a participant resident. And so for migrants, they're living in this paradoxical situation where, on the one hand, reception centers are set up with, they're supposed to be set up with resources for psychological support, like mental health, but also language classes and other kinds of things that would help somebody integrate, we'll use scare quotes, but integrate into Italian society. So there's a kind of expectation that this period of limbo is also a moment of starting the processes of integrating into Italian life. But they're also living with the extreme uncertainty about whether they'll even get their papers. And so they have to negotiate this expectation to integrate with the uncertainty and the fear that actually they might get rejected and have to leave the country. And I think that makes it a really challenging time for people, for local communities, partly again because of the geographical realities of that, but also because despite the increasing presence of migrants, there's just not often a lot of established ways for people to connect. I think there continues to be a lot of suspicion or just simply disconnect. So it could be that a local sees migrants most often if they're asking for money outside a bar, or if they're seeming to be like wandering aimlessly towards the city center, when in reality, like that's the only way they have to get there. So these are some of the factors that I think shape that period, both for local communities and for migrants themselves.
These official reception centers aside, we also see NGOs, solidarity groups trying to offer a solution, at least a temporary solution for migrants. And you mentioned one example in particular, an organization that was called Baobab Experience. So if we look at these private responses, which aren't necessarily centers, but often simply informal encampments, what are the conditions like in those places?
Yeah, here again, you see a lot of variety, and these encampments are something that we saw. I mean, they've long been present, but we saw them grow in number in the 2010s throughout Europe. So people may remember the stories about the camps around Calais, France. It's certainly true in Bosnia, border camps. So I cite these examples to say that people on the move are constantly coming together and figuring out how to create a temporary safe space where they can build shelter together. That's happening also in Italy in different ways, not always supported by an NGO. But there are a lot of groups that are working to connect with people once an encampment is formed, or support people in building an encampment for migrants who end up unhoused for a range of reasons. And Baobab Experience has been one of those groups. Their role has changed a lot over the years. When I was doing this field work, they had to close a cultural center that they were running. And after a series of kind of intense run-ins and discussions with the local government, they ended up occupying several different areas. The longest occupation was on this asphalt lot near one of Rome's main train stations, near Tiburtina station. And so I think Baobab Experience would insist that they weren't in charge of the camp, but that they were there supporting people who were moving through. And they were also coordinating a lot of the services that were making themselves available. So this meant in practice, people would come, word would spread, people knew that they could find a tent, or that they would have some community for a few nights as they were moving through, their transit migrants moving through Italy. Or people who had left the official reception center because conditions were so bad there. So they would stay with Baobab for a couple of nights. Sometimes they would stay for much longer. So I spoke with people who were there for months at a time as well. And the camp also changed in size. So in some months, it had even up to 300 people. Sometimes it had 75 people. So it changed a lot. Baobab's role there was important also because they could help. And Baobab is this activist collective. It's an NGO of made up of Italians and migrants, so people from a lot of different places. And so one of the priorities that they had when this camp was running near Tiburtina was making sure that any minors or women that they would get priority housing if a space opened up in a reception center. In my experience, I mean, camps are incredibly precarious places, and they're living with the elements. There was no running water there. So really harsh conditions. There was also a lot of incredible community building in that space, and people really, like in those spaces, people were thinking about the future in very different ways and trying to carve out a different way of connecting, sharing the city, thinking about systems, structures that could exist outside the official systems that were failing them. One of the reasons that camp in particular existed is because of two things. The Rome government refused to open more accommodations for migrants as numbers were increasing. And they also started cracking down on informal settlements that didn't have this kind of NGO connection. So a lot of people ended up at Baobab after other settlements were raided and closed. And the Baobab encampments were also pretty regularly raided. People's stuff was taken, that kind of thing. So I talked to a lot of people who were glad to be there given the options that they had, but also struggled because, for example, if police came and raided the camp and took somebody's tent and their belongings, then often they had to start the whole process over again. They lost their documents. They had to refile. They lost track of appointments in that way. So it was a kind of tolerated encampment because the city wasn't providing other accommodations. So they needed the encampments to work, but they also needed it to be clear that they didn't condone them at the same time. And so they kept people regularly unsettled in those ways.
Earlier in the episode, we touched a little bit on migrant labor. One of the sectors that migrants might work in is agriculture. And you mentioned that, of course, there's scope for exploitation of migrants. How is this kind of precarious labor linked to precarious mobility?
This is something I also learned about through these encampments, by the way, in part because agricultural labor, because it's seasonal, because so much of it in Italy is uncontracted, means that people who may have been in Italy for much longer, migrants, still have to stay on the move and are still, moving between different places and unable to really establish themselves. So in thinking about precarious labor, I draw on the work of Nick Dines and Eric Darigo, who talk about the refugiization of labor. And they're thinking in part about the fact that precarious migration supports industries that rely on this kind of exploitation. So it's helpful in an agricultural sector that operates by underpaying people, by giving fewer contracts for workers, right? That can make more profit in these ways. Precarious migration can feed directly into that body of laborers. And so that means that on the one hand, while legal status is always important and getting that recognition can give somebody access to more rights and resources, in a context like agricultural labor, it often doesn't really even matter because you might have refugee status and still not get a contract, and so still end up working precariously. So one of the consequences of that is that it perpetuates all of these other aspects of what I think about as this broader emergency apparatus. So it keeps people in precarious positions. It means they're not accessing their rent. They're not finding permanent housing. They're not able to do the kinds of things that would help prepare them for sort of longer term stability. In Italy, that's also complicated because of the criminal organizations and the specific kinds of exploitation that happen in that sector. So there's a longer history of exploitation also of Italians, when it was Italians who were doing the majority of this labor, and of Eastern Europeans. And now a majority of the foreign farm workers are African and are now incredibly underpaid and kept to account by this system called the caporale that holds people that organizes the labor, takes a cut off of what people make, and keeps them in these precarious positions, and often directs them to live in especially precarious camps while they're working that seasonal labor. On the flip side, there are a lot of efforts now to try and overcome that system, and so to think about how to counter criminal activity at the same time that people are supporting migrant rights and labor rights. So these efforts are happening, but there's a lot of work still to be done.
To conclude this episode, I would like to ask you for a final reflection when we think about migrant rights. You argue in your book that the violence that this emergency narrative creates, the violence that migrants are encountering, is evidence of the failures of empathy. So how, in your opinion, can we perhaps think about building empathy? What does this mean for you? But also, how can we get people to think differently about migration and counter this emergency narrative?
When I talk about the failures of empathy, I mean things like the image of the Syrian toddler Alan Kurdi that circulated in 2015. He died on a Turkish beach, his body washed ashore. Photographs of that circulated worldwide. Donations to organizations like the Red Cross went up immediately following that and lasted for about 6 weeks and then went back down, studies have shown. So there was arguably a lot of empathy, and it was very short-lived and didn't lead to any significant changes. I mean, what we've seen since then is a hardening of borders, the externalization of borders, continued deaths at sea, and a disregard for the rights of people crossing the sea. So empathy hasn't gotten us where we need to go. It hasn't given us the answers for figuring out how to manage migration while upholding people's rights and dignity. And so this is another way that I think about the role of witnessing, that witnessing can't be understood or shouldn't be understood as an appeal to empathy or as something that's going to make people feel something for a distant other and therefore enact some kind of change. But I think the witnessing that works is when it makes us as the audience rethink or understand our own positions in a very different way. So in my own experience as a white US citizen in these moving in these spaces, thinking differently about how race operates, how whiteness operates in these spaces, how the place of colonial history in shaping these realities had radically changed how I thought about my own role and what might be possible. And I think that some of the witnessing that people on the move are doing themselves is also moving towards this. So holding people account, not for feeling something for another person, although of course it's not that they wouldn't welcome that, but that it might make people rethink their own positions and the actions that they can actually take.
Thank you, Eleanor, for sitting down with me to talk about Mediterranean crossings and Italy's migration crisis narrative. Eleanor Paynter is the author of Emergency in Transit, and that was Common Ground with me, Sonja Wolf. Thank you, Eleanor.
Thanks so much.